and he was doing some deadlifts, and he uses bar velocities. Well, he tracks that. There's a device you just put on the straight bar, and it's an accelerometer of some sort, and it gives you bar velocity measurements.
No kidding.
So,
Huh?
yeah, and it's you can see this too. You can just visually see it. It's one of the things that I hate to stir up kind of old shit, but talking about reps. Well, it's related to reps and reserves and training to failure. And one thing you'll see, of course, it just matches physiology of skeletal muscle is that if skeletal muscle fatigues, it will slow. Right, that just
Yeah.
happens. Contractile property slow, and of course, as you're getting towards that last rep before you reach failure, you need to start recruiting all the motor units at the highest firing rates you possibly can. And if you look at the force velocity curve, this means you're going to have to move at a slower velocity because the faster you move, the less force you produce. So the slower you move, the more force you produce in those motor units that are available because they're getting tired. And anyway, so you can look at the last rep or two, and if someone, unless they're just faking it, but if someone just based on what muscle can do in terms of force production, it's going to slow down as you near failure. So Mike Israetel and Lyle McDonald were going at it. This has been a year and a half, 2 years ago, maybe.
Okay.
And they had this really sort of fabulously entertaining, mainly because Lyle can just, I think, by his own admission, be kind of an asshole. He sort of revels in that, right?
Okay.
But he went and he analyzed. He just pulled videos out of Mike training and several other people training, some people that he works with. And what I remember from one of the videos is, and he was measuring or looking at, he was counting bar velocity. So he was just sort of doing a stopwatch measurement of the number of seconds it took in the first few reps when they're fresh versus that last rep.
Yeah.
And if someone's just, dumping and they're acting like they're struggling, it's slowing the bar down intentionally to give the impression that they're really reaching failure, you're going to see a slowing of the bar in that last rep. If that last rep doesn't look like a grinder, right, then chances are you had something left. So he had two women, I think they were figure competitors, and they were built like brick shit houses. I think they're from maybe from Thailand or Malaysia or something like that. And they were training like monsters, and their bar velocity was slowing. And then he had like a 78-year-old grandmother that he found. Either he was working with her or he found her video. He watched. He timed her last rep, and of course they were all slowing to 4-second grinder reps at the end. So bar velocity tells you something about performance. If you can move a weight faster, that means that's an improvement in performance, even if it's just like a 1 rep max or a max effort single.
Yeah.
Right? If it's faster than what you could do previously, that's an improvement.
Yeah, that makes total sense, man.
Mm-hmm. Tells you how hard it was, basically.
All right. Well, I look forward to this conversation today. Wow, we got a bunch of people with us already. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I'm going to start up from the top here. I'll just throw these comments up. We did have a bunch of comments before we started, but Chris is with us, and Chris Madden is with us. Of course, Lucas is with us. And he said, "Greetings, Scott. Good to see you come back with no scars from kangaroos." Yeah. What's up, Tanja? Thanks for joining us. And let's see who else here. Matt's with us. All right. That's cool, man. We got like 40 people already, and we literally have just started this thing up, man. I'm excited today because, like I said, I'll introduce us, and I'll tell you what I was thinking, and I'm looking forward to talking a little bit about IGF-1, but you have like a whole thing set up for Mountain Dog, right? That's going to be coming out soon.
And in the next week or so, it's a 90-minute 2-part presentation.
Cool. And you have this on video?
It was a video. Yeah, it's a Q&A. I've been doing those. This is like the sort of the 4th and 5th one I had to do a combo. I just get a question. Usually I modify the question. The questions are usually like, how should I take IGF-1 to get swole, right? I'm like, come on. So, but I sort of cultivate the question so that I can make it as informational, educational as possible. So this one was on IGF-1. And I didn't. I mean, I literally feel like I barely even, from my standards at least, I barely even scratched the surface.
Yeah.
This is such a phenomenally. There's rabbit holes. There's black holes and black holes of rabbit holes
Really?
in the IGF literature. Yeah, it's absolutely phenomenally interesting. Um, it's like probably one of the most complex areas that I've ever tried to look into as far as physiology and what's going on there in terms of the muscle biology and muscle physiology and all the inner workings that are interwoven with the actions of IGF-1.
Well, we'll cover just the basic surface of the exterior rabbit hole, and then you'll go on a deep dive.
There's the rabbit hole
over at Mountain Dog. And then we'll take your guys' questions too. So if you guys want to ask questions, feel free to comment with questions. We'll be up for a good hour or so. Bring us in as usual, guys. Welcome back to Muscle Minds with Scott Stevenson. I'm Scott McNally, and all of our programming is brought to you by Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach. You can go to byobbcoach.com to get Scott's book, or you can go to Amazon to get the hardcover. That's what I did. And it basically will take you from prepare through your off season, get ready for your show, take you all the way through your contest, peak and everything, and reverse you out too, plus all your training and everything. It's all basically figured out in that book if you want to do it yourself and be your own bodybuilding coach. We're brought to you by you guys. Thank you to everybody from Patreon. I dropped a message to let our Patreon people know that this was happening. I also dropped a little MP3 on the audio channel so that those guys weren't left out. I don't want to leave our audio people out. So hopefully we have some of them tuning in. Let me know if you guys are tuning in from normally being an audio listener and you heard that message. We are brought to you by TrueNutrition.com. Use our code THINK. I just placed an order today, Scott, for more of their hydrolyzed beef collagen because I'm a huge fan of that, and I never want to stop taking it for the rest of my life. I wish I started taking it 20 years sooner. I just get the unflavored version, and I mix it in my coffee. Use our code THINK over there. Get some additional savings. And for our Canadians, supplementsource.ca. They have awesome deals that change week to week. So if you're not picky on what you want to get, you just want to find a hell of a deal, go over there because you'll get some awesome stuff that normally would have been like $60 for $20. Plus they've got ephedrine and all that other stuff over there. So check them out. That's really all I got. Of course, check out STROM Sports Nutrition for you guys in the UK too. They're more of a sponsor for drugs and stuff, but I wanted to mention it here as well. So what's up, Scott, today? Oh, I'm seeing people who are from the audio too. So thanks for stopping by, Mitch, and anybody else. As I was saying before we officially got started here, we are going to do a Q&A with you guys. So post up your questions. I wanted to talk to Scott a little bit more about reps in reserve because I hung out with a bunch of people over in Australia that were all about reps in reserve. And I had a lot of questions, Scott. I had questions.
You're cringing.
I got some stuff I got to get off my chest. And we're going to talk a little bit about IGF LR3 or just IGF-1. That's what you really looked at, right? Not directly at LR3, right?
I kind of covered the whole thing. I went into the DES 1.3, IGF-1 LR3, or LR3, IGF-1 long, R3, IGF-1, the whole kit and caboodle. So this is your first podcast back since you've been back from Australia. Right?
Yes. Okay. So I'm kind of a little bit rusty. You know what I'm saying?
I imagine, right?
It's been almost 3 weeks, I think, since I've been on the air now. So I'm glad to be back, though, and it's nice for this to be our first one. I'm glad we could do it live, too,
So cool. Yeah, I was just the urge to ask you all about the Australia trip, but I'm interested to hear your rant or your pseudo rant or what it was that was kind of itching at you when you heard people talking about reps in reserve over there.
Okay, so I heard one of the talks that were at this lecture series. It was specifically about training, and there was a great deal of focus on reps in reserve. In the way that it was put together, if I had never trained before, I kind of get the vibe that you don't ever failure is kind of a thing you don't want to do. And talking to people through the weekend, I kind of got the vibe that the idea of going to failure is an antiquated idea. That's what people used to do. That's what all the bros used to do. And that's what people on gear do. That if you're on gear, that you can handle that. But if you're not on gear, you can't. And so I started asking more people because a lot of the people that we were talking to over the weekends or the week really, and then beyond that, were people that were involved in like the functional training space. And it's definitely a newer school approach. And the vibe I get is that most of these people are unenhanced, that these guys are natural.
Right.
And they feel that it needs to be done a different way. And then just, some of the feedback I got, because then I started asking other people, I was like, what do you think about this? This is what we heard. This is what I listened to. And, here's where I've come from. What are your thoughts? And I heard responses such as, well, if you don't know what failure is, and we've talked about this, if you don't know what failure is, then, how can you know what 3 reps in reserve is? But if you don't know how to recover properly, then should you really be going to failure to begin with?
Yeah, that's the whole equation. You have to be able to recover from your stimulus.
Yeah.
Right?
So
if you have suboptimal recovery,
and the thought was that people don't know how to recover. The thought was that people really don't have that stuff lined up. They aren't taking care of their like their sleep. They aren't taking care of the modalities that we can do to improve our recovery. And so maybe they shouldn't go to failure.
So let me sort of summarize. So since we're half-assing our recovery, we should half-ass our training. Is that kind of is that the logic? I mean, it's true that I definitely wouldn't disagree with that. You can't, for people who are doing lifestyle clients, you can't just train them into oblivion. When you know that they're going out on, you train them on a Friday and they go out and they have 8 beers with their buddies and eat wings, or if they come in, and they're hungover or halfway hungover on a day you're training them, you have to adjust the training stimulus to match the recovery. Otherwise you'll eventually kind of go downhill, or you certainly won't progress. So there's absolute truth to that. I was being kind of facetious, but actually being realistic. There's total truth to that. You said a lot there, Scott. One thing popped in my head too is that with beginners, 2 things. One, almost anything's going to work. You have this, for many people, you have this sort of ceiling effect, which is great. Statistically, I mentioned this many times before, statistically for purpose of studies, you need to have a training effect. Or ideally, you have a training effect, at least in one of your conditions. If your training doesn't work, which happens sometimes in studies, your training doesn't work, then if you're trying to compare one type of training with another, or training with a supplement or something on top of the training, you need to have a good training effect. So you use beginners because they have the best training effect. The law of diminishing returns suggests that when the stimulus is brand new or novel, which it ultimately is with a beginner, you're good to go. But also, if someone is a beginner, you want to make sure their execution is on point, especially for the big lifts where things can be dangerous. So taking, even with for instance, DC training, which I've talked a lot about in the last few podcasts. I've done 3 podcasts in German the last week or so, and 2 of them we talked about DC training a good bit.
Nice.
And even with DC training, he was on the heavy sets of squats, for instance, or heavy bent over rows or heavy rack deads. Those were not rest pause sets where you're taking them to failure multiple times, because that gets dangerous on your low back. And this is for intermediate to advanced people who know how to push to failure. So even in that program, which is very much about giving everything you possibly can and digging in, there were some adjustments to how the sets were executed, that you don't do rest pause sets for certain exercises because it's inherently dangerous to go to failure. And as a side note to that, it's always bizarre to me. There was a lifter, you probably saw this. This is in the last 6 months or so, a guy who died squatting. He was outside the rack, and he squatted, and he tried to dump, and he had I'm not sure exactly what the exact cause of death was, but it was due to the accident incurred by not having appropriate spotting and not being in a rack.
Yeah.
And I see that all the time. People want to squat, and I mean, maybe they want to increase danger and the fear of if I don't get this, then that's it.
It's a motivation.
It's a motivation, but it's absolutely just asinine in my mind.
Sure.
Power racks are there for a reason. The safety hooks are there for a reason in the Smith machine. There's really no reason to be doing anything where you can't with a straight bar, but you can't. Even with like incline presses, when I would do DC training, I'd do it myself sometimes. This was kind of crazy, but I would, if I was using a free bar, I'd get a rack and I'd move an incline bench over to the rack, and I'd go to failure with the safety bars in place, and then I would either, if I needed to, I'd strip a plate off the side and I'd power clean the weight up, or I'd hook it in kind of like a Zercher squat, hook it in my elbows and put it back up on, so I could start the next rep that way. So you can always figure out a way. Where there's a will, there's a way. Dumbbells, you can do this. Another kind of a side, you can get daisy chains, or you can get power hooks. They're being sold as something else now.
Dumbbells, you can just drop them too.
You can just drop them too.
You
but
have
for DC training, you hook them up on if you have a pull-up bar or you have a bar, you hook it there and you just set it at the bottom of your range of motion, and you've got spotting for your dumbbell. So there's always a way. Not training to failure has some practical advantages, and it makes sense. I've got that set up in fortitude training. But if the argument that because your recovery is not in place, and that's the reason not to go to failure, I can see that argument. That sort of does make sense. You have to match the stimulus to the recovery ability. But eventually, and this is the thing that my sort of experience suggests to me, and it's been a while now, but Mike Israetel, for instance, who's sort of the main proponent of reps and reserve type of training, he and I think we pretty much came to an agreement on Steve Hall's podcast a few years ago. I'm not trying to call Mike out or anything, but eventually when you get more and more advanced, you're going to have to increase the potency of the set, meaning taking it closer to failure. Now, if your recovery is suboptimal, then your training is going to have to match your recovery ability. So the question then becomes, if we're making it sort of very simple here, you've got suboptimal recovery, and you're becoming more advanced now, and you need to create what is actually a stimulus. Do you do 10 sets with 2 or 3 reps in reserve, or you do 5 sets that are actually taken to failure or to 0 reps in reserve?
Yeah.
And that 5 sets where you've got a more potent stimulus, I think, is eventually where you're going to have to go, because at some point in time, and this is where the reps in reserve thing has to be taken in context in terms of effective reps. It's a really nice way of viewing things, is that eventually you don't have any effective reps if you're stopping 3 reps shy of failure. That set really doesn't do anything for you, the way I sort of conceive of this. And also, people engage in this. I think it's maybe someone who happens to be listening, probably not. It would be nice. So someone who does, there are ways to design programs where you use progressive overload based on reps in reserve.
Yeah, and that's what this gentleman Jacob was talking about doing.
Right.
But he had said though, and he had been he had said he was highly influenced by Eric Helms and a couple other guys, and Eric was at the seminar as well. So here's the thing: is I see all of these guys as being really bright. They're smart guys, but the question keeps coming back to me is are you really going to, are we raising a generation of lifters that don't know what failure means then? That's my concern. The opposite being, years ago, man, and still to this day, really, a lot of guys are pushing every set that they do to failure in the gym, and they're making progress. And I look at a guy like Kuba, who we had on, who was the last episode we had out. Man, he's made tremendous progress. Now, that said, he's on gear. I almost felt part of this too that confused me or made the conversation difficult, I'll say, is I almost felt as though I was being disqualified from being part of the conversation as having a valuable point, because everything, even talking to Eric, it was kind of like, well, you guys are on gear, There's kind of that was so you don't really know kind of feeling. And nobody said to me those words exactly, but I did get that feeling I got the feeling of and maybe this is part of it is me, just this is what I thought, but the vibe was kind of you didn't really have to figure it out, because you always had the gear there to make up for the fact that you were going to failure, and that you can push further because you're on gear. But then I look at guys like Jeremy Jason, who's a follower of Fortitude Training. By the way, he's I'm not sure how close you follow him, but he became pro in a natural organization last year.
I saw.
Yeah, just competed, looked fantastic, looked out of this world. He's
Mm-hmm.
switching gears to powerlifting now. He has a 20-year-old nephew, I believe it is,
All right.
who thinks he's the strongest in the family. So Jeremy Jason's going to show him up, and now he's switching gears to powerlifting. Right. He's only 5 pounds up from his stage weight. We just saw him yesterday for his son's birthday. Face still looking like Skeletor, and and he's training hard now. He's
reversing out nicely.
Yeah.
He's been doing fortitude training for 3, maybe 4 years longer. I don't want to over-exaggerate it.
We've trained together too.
Failure.
Yeah.
Yeah. You train to failure. He's a natural guy. It's just totally fine.
Strong as heck too.
Yeah. Well, fortitude training is focused on progressive overload, so you do become strong in that regard. So there's an interesting phenomenon there, and I want to. So, and this is something that has sort of been something that I've been trying to bridge with what I do sort of in the bodybuilding space.
Okay.
Is we have the pros who oftentimes will have sort of this called a one-sided opinion. Is like you scientists who sit in your ivory tower wearing your lab coat, like you don't know what's going on, like you don't know what it's like to do that. And then of course we have people like Aaron Helms, for instance, who have been training for a long time. They know their way in and out of a gym, without a doubt. And so there's the interesting thing from the perspective of those bros is many of them say they just kind of throw the science out, like it doesn't matter, it doesn't work. But the thing is that they're not trained as scientists, so they're discarding the scientific perspective without first understanding it because they haven't been trained as scientists.
Yeah.
And I've been trained as a scientist, so I understand the scientific perspective. I train the bros perspective, and I try to combine the two. And as I always say, both of those perspectives take place in the same universe, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So there is some there, and I can see why this may have been the finding of a particular study, and I like to try to match those things up with what the bro might see as perspective. But I think it's kind of a logical fallacy for those bros who just say, "Oh, all the science is bullshit," and they just kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater because they don't know that baby, they don't know that bathwater, right? Because they're not trained scientists.
Yeah.
In the same vein, and I'm not trying to call anyone out here in particular, but in the same vein, if a natural athlete says, well, and you can know a good bit through the scientific perspective on this, but if they say, well, you guys are on gear, it's a totally different thing, and you can't speak to what matters as a natural, how can they possibly say that they haven't been on before if they haven't used before? It's the same sort of logical fallacy as someone throwing out the science who doesn't understand the science.
Okay, yeah.
Take someone who's maybe trained for a long time as both a natural and someone who's used, and they may understand the difference. And the way we did a podcast on this back in the with Paul Carter and Alan Aragon. I think we talked about this once.
Oh yeah, okay.
The topic and the basic thing that sort of that I kind of recognize, the conclusion I've kind of come to, and there's high variability here. Some people are responders to gear, sometimes people are not. Some people are responders to training, some people are not. And the impact of gear on training is going to make a difference. But to some degree, it'll all sort of come out in the wash, I think. You may be someone who goes from benching 2 1/4 for 6 reps to 405 for 6 reps. So everything you become stronger, but it may turn out that your volume of training is the same. You're using higher loads; those have a greater impact on your recovery, but you still got recovery limitations that have to come into play. And the interesting thing too, like if we look at where's the evidence? If you look at how most of the best pros train, and I don't know if this is the case with naturals or not, but most of the best enhanced pros, well, I don't say most, but many of them don't train to failure. They've just got great genetics.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
They so it's not like
no matter what.
Like everyone's just trained to failure, and it doesn't really matter. They can just do that and get away with it. So there's sort of a logical fallacy behind saying that none of this really applies to gear because it just covers up all the mistakes you can possibly make. There still is some limitation to training, and as a piece of empirical evidence to that effect, we have dog crap training. And I wish that all the pictures and things that Dante posted way back in the day when he was actively training people were still available on Intense Muscle. Those didn't get properly archived. But he worked with plenty of natural people, and he worked with plenty of enhanced people, and everyone was doing DC training, which is taken to whatever you can you can bring as far as failure goes. And
Yeah.
both natties and enhanced people made gains with that, pretty much on an equal footing. And I work with both doing DC training in particular.
So
They both made gains. So
couple other things. I talked to Luke Liam. Do you know Luke?
mm-hmm.
Luke.
Lehman?
So I asked Luke about this, and his thought was, he said, well, you know what? I've trained with Eric Helms before, and Eric's version of 3 reps in reserve is different than what I think is getting interpreted by like the final person who's listening to these conversations. Right. That he trains hard. Like he is his 3 reps in reserve is probably like our 3 reps in reserve, which is going to be like basically failure.
I believe it.
Just meaning that, you know,
people.
just meaning that like, you know, you're not getting that last 3 reps with like gun to your head reps, which is still kind of pretty much you're pretty dang close at that point. So that was one thing. And then the other thing, now maybe a benefit that I can see here, 4 reps in reserve, is this. Because like I said, I literally asked everybody. So I asked Luke about this. I asked everybody we came in contact with that was in the industry in one way or another. I worked out with Eugene Tao, and we did an upper body workout. Couple exercises for back, couple exercises for chest. We had a blast, by the way, man, in his personal studio gym, which is absolutely beautiful, hand-picked equipment. You would love it, Scott. He had like a row of 5, I believe they were Gen 1 Nautilus machines. So I was eyeing this. It was supposed to be a behind the neck pull down, but we sat in it facing away, I believe, and then pulling down to the front, to the front. And it was a good machine. That was like, I had my eye on that thing. I was like, man, I got to know how that feels. So we took 2 exercises for back to like hard failure. And then from there, like I was shot, he was done. And his thought was this, he was like, listen, so maybe if we didn't go quite as hard, you know, we backed off just a little bit, say 10%, we may have been able to do a 3rd exercise. And made up for that with volume, you know, maybe not torch the CNS quite as hard. It would be my interpretation of that then, and kind of fill it in with a little bit more volume. I could see there being a benefit to that, especially for myself with my, you know, health condition and stuff.
So we've talked about some important studies. Here's some of my favorite studies. We got the study where they train one leg 2 or 3 sets a week, the other leg 5 times a week, 3 sets per workout. On average, there was no difference between those conditions, but when they look at the individuals, some better with more volume, higher frequency, some better the other way around. We've also got the study that just mentioned about a month ago. I'd mentioned on the German podcast I've done too, where they had heavyweight, lower reps versus lighter weight, higher reps, which you see in numerous studies. Those equal out in terms of the hypertrophy that you can evoke. And when they looked then at those who were the better responders, sort of the upper half versus those who didn't respond so much, and then they switched conditions. They went from heavy to light or light to heavy, either way. All those individuals who were not doing well, regardless of which way they switched to, regardless of their initial condition, with one exception, I think, they all ended up being better responders in the second half with the other program. We've also got then now a ton of studies, mostly with beginners, although there's a sort of a sub-analysis that's done in a Brad Schoenfeld meta-analysis where advanced trainers seem to do better training to failure. There's some evidence suggesting that. But we've got tons of studies looking at failure training versus non-failure training. In the early meta-analysis, it doesn't really matter, right? Doesn't make a difference. Or maybe even it's not even to your advantage. What I suspect is, just like those other things, volume and frequency or high reps versus low reps, we're finding on average that there doesn't seem to make big of a difference, or maybe failure is not the best thing for untrained individuals to start off that way. I think that there's an individual variability there, depending on the person. And one important feature of why that is, and you brought up a really good question, as to in regards to one of those sets of studies, is do we know why that is? Is that a biological, physiological phenomenon, or is a psychological phenomenon that someone likes to train heavy or they like to train lighter? they just hate the high rep stuff, or they like the heavier stuff, or what have you.
Yeah.
Training to failure there's a huge spread there in terms of the actual reps that are in reserve versus what people will choose to, where the people will choose to stop and how they perceive their 3 reps in reserve. Eric Helms' 3 reps in reserve is different than the average newbie's 3 reps in reserve, without a doubt, right?
Absolutely.
And there's also the study came out showing people were self-selecting like 50-some% of their 1 rep max when they train. So
even advanced guys, right?
Yeah, people just So there's, and a lot of advanced people don't like train like just maniacs. What I mentioned the other day is that like when Dave Henry and I and my buddy Mike Gustafson, he might listen to this, when we were doing DC training in the gym back in Tucson and at my place, like there was nobody that I saw training that way. There's just no one who was doing that. People were always staring at us when we're doing our Widowmakers, and they're staring at Dave because he's Dave, right?
Right.
But people just didn't train that way. So I suspect that probably for perhaps some biological, physiological reasons in terms of what it means in terms of potency of dose to turn on all the processes that lead to growth. Some people are just genetically equipped that hypertrophy is a prominent means of adaptation. You go in and they train, they train with heavy enough weight, and there's some effort there. It's not like every set's a death set. They're just going to have growth. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
And we see that over the spectrum of load. We see with blood flow restriction training and the high rep training that you can go like 30, 40, 50% of a 1 rep max, and with blood flow restriction training in particular, even the lighter weights. And that is enough tension to produce muscle growth. You don't got to train at 80% of a 1 rep max or 60% or above, which some of the early studies sort of suggested before we had this higher rep stuff and more of the blood flow restriction studies. So some people, you just put a load on there that's heavier than a grocery bag, the things you typically would engage with in your day-to-day living, and they're going to grow, right? Other people are going to need to have a more potent, very specific stimulus physiologically in order to turn on growth. I think this is my idea. And you've got those people who are genetically gifted. They have progressive overload, and there's 2 sides to this progressive overload idea. Normally we think of it in terms of like the logbook. It's like, okay, you got to get 1 or 2 more reps with this weight, or add a little bit of more weight, micro load, and get the equal reps. And you have to every single time drive that. And I think that's the most certain way to drive progressive overload. And they do that in practically all studies. They use a progressive overload model. This is the interesting thing, is that progressive overload, really meticulous progressive overload, is what takes place in these studies. And most of them are training to failure in the trainings, unless they're specifically looking at that. Most people aren't logbooking their stuff.
Yeah.
They're on their phone, looking at Instagram, or whatever it is that they're doing, but they're not logging their stuff. They're not, putting that carrot out in front of the horse's nose and say, I got to get more reps. I got to get the same reps with this weight.
Yeah.
That progressive overload is going to drive the adaptation as long as you can recover. If you just naturally grow because you've got good genetics, then you've got the other side of the progressive overload coin taken care of, in that you just adapt. So when you come back in, like most pros aren't logging their stuff. Many do now, more so maybe than.
I think it's
more popular now, right?
Yeah.
But they just get stronger. When they start off, they don't got to do any of that. They just get strong. So they come back. So they like, let's say they incline press 275, and they get the 2.25. They're like, oh, that feels like tiddlywinks on the bar. I'm going 315 today, baby. And They get that. They just get naturally stronger. So the progressive overload just happens as a consequence of their adaptive capabilities. So I think there are going to be people. So that's the physiological, biological side of it. Some people just grow better. Some people have to drive the growth. Some people have to focus more on the one side of progressive overload. Some people on the other side. And then there's also the psychological side of things. Taylor, who was he passed away. He was running the podcast way back when.
Oh yeah, Taylor Normandeau.
Taylor Normandeau, yeah. I remember he was like one of the only people that I can recall who tried fortitude training out and didn't like it.
Really?
Just didn't dig it. Yeah, he didn't like it. He's the only person I can remember, actually. And I don't think he just didn't like training to failure. I think he just didn't. That just wasn't his thing. He should want to do that. I wish so I could ask him, but some people are just not going to do that. So like they're just not going to do well. Actually, and I also have that story from one of my trainers, my first trainer at my gym way back when we started to do DC training, and we got to the Widowmaker and squats. And I was kind of showing him the ropes. He's like, Scott, I want to train with you. I want to get big, man. I want to get big. I'm like, okay, I'm starting DC training here again.
Yeah.
And I did the Widowmaker, and I got done. It was on a Smith machine. I crawled out from the bar, and then I went over to the place. I'm like, so what do you want on there, man? He's like, I don't want to do that. I'm not doing that. This is it. I'm done. He just stopped. It's like, that was the last time we trained together. He didn't want to do it.
Yeah, I've met people like that, you know, and you get it. Yeah. Like, and it's you who were the one who really got me to open my eyes to this, because there was a time I thought that everybody needed to train really hard, really intense. Mm-hmm. And you told me, you're like, well, you know, and it goes back to this. Somebody had said, like, how do I focus and get my focus up at the gym? And I wrote this little thing up, and I said, well, this is the way I approach going to the gym. And I said, I really focus on what I'm doing before I even get there. And I get to the gym and I don't get involved with talking to people. You know, I had this whole thing, and I talked about my warm up and that, and I sent it to you, Scott. And I was like, look at this. I was really proud of it. And you're like, well, that's really nice, Scott, if that's the way you like to train. And the conversation came out to be that, like, we're going to do what we enjoy a lot longer than we're going to stick to something that we don't like. You know, at the end of the day, I mean, this is supposed to be fun, you know?
Mm-hmm. I don't think I've mentioned this, but it is an important insight. So when I did the training that we did for my dissertation study was electrical stimulation training on an isokinetic dynamometer. So it was non-voluntary, right? I mean, they volunteered. They were willing volunteers in the study, but the training was involuntary contractions.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So we put the stim on. They're on the dynamometer. The stim was set to go on for 2 seconds. It was 9-degree range of motion, 9 degrees per second. So it was up and down. The stim would turn on. They do a knee extension up and back. Yeah. The stim would turn off. So I had it set up. You know, there was a rest interval in there so that because the fatigue would be so high with e-stim. But all the training was like that. But the thing is, in the muscle that's activated when you use e-stim with the right frequency, it's all out. That muscle is maximally contracted on the concentric and on the eccentric. So because the dynamometer lets you go up at a speed, you can't go any faster, any slower. It was set to 9 degrees, isokinetic, same speed, isovelocity. And then it came right back down no matter how hard you pushed. No person was stronger than machine. So the forces were phenomenal. So the stimulus compared to voluntary training, at least in sort of the preliminary study that we borrowed that protocol from, produced on average about twice the muscle growth in an 8-week training period than voluntary training. It's just a more potent stimulus. This was only like, I think 3 sets twice a week is what we did.
Okay.
Like that. So more potent stimulus. Now, if you tried to do 10 sets or 15 sets that way, it would have been too much. So we always got to remember that everything happens in the context, and this is important for this conversation, of this, the way I see it at least, this hormesis idea that you've got a dose response. More is better to a certain point where you have an optimal dose relative to recovery, and you go beyond that, it's too much. But in this case, e-stim versus voluntary, that e-stim was more potent than the voluntary, at least over 8 weeks.
Yeah.
That's what we used for my dissertation. And I had those data, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but I remember the biggest responder, he had an increase of quad cross-sectional areas, either 21 or 23%, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. And that's like totally noticeable. It doesn't seem that much, but that's like, oh my God, your quad blew up. Average was like 5 to 10%. And there were some people who were down like 2 or 3%, right? So that is taking the psychological all out of it, and with a really potent stimulus, which is akin to training to failure. In fact, that's more potent than training to failure, because when you do free weights, the first rep's easy. It's not effective. Well, in this scenario, actually, with e-stim, the first rep might be even more effective because you've got more force on the first rep. The fatigue is less. So in terms of force being produced, tension in the muscle, it's actually higher. So all of those reps are effective, so to speak. And that's why with that given a small amount of volume, it was a better stimulus. And there's still variability. There's still a Gaussian distribution. There's still a bell curve distribution in terms of how much people grow.
Yeah.
So I suspect it's the same in terms of this idea of more volume with reps in reserve versus training to failure, and maybe the same amount of volume or less volume. You compare someone who tries to do 8 sets all the way to failure, that might be beyond their point of optimal stimulus because they can't recover from it. They might be better with 8 sets, 3 reps in reserve because they can recover from that. But they might be even better with 4 sets training to failure because that's more potent. But they think, well, I did better reps in reserve than to failure. It's like, well, yeah, because the total volume was beyond your optimal volume for recovering.
Yeah.
Right. So the thing is that you've really got, it's not just failure, it's volume and reps in reserve. And that's where this effective reps idea kind of comes in place. But all effective reps are not created equally. So the rep before you fail is perhaps more effective, but it also has a greater impact on your recovery.
Right.
So you've got then this trade-off between stimulus and recovery. So stimulus and fatigue, so to speak. I don't like to use that word fatigue, but stimulus and impact on recovery. So 3 reps reserve, 2 reps reserve. Maybe that's the best ratio. That 2 or 3 reps in reserve for some people. So they'd be better off gathering effective reps at 2 to 3 reps in reserve and doing 8 sets. Someone else might be better off because they've got good recovery ability. They can handle a higher stimulus, even though the impact on recovery for them is not so great if they do fewer sets closer to failure. So everyone has their own formulation, they have their own formula, but eventually I think the thing in general is that many people, eventually here's the thing, this is kind of the phenomenon that I see is like, if progressive overload is important, I think most people would agree there's got to be some sort of progressive overload there, either that you're driving it with training, and then I'll shut up because I know you have some thoughts, or your recovery is allowing you to progress. I think at some point along that line, there's going to have to be effort that will have to bring you closer to failure. And it could be that effort is maybe the effort is in more volume. Some people have done that and it's worked for them. But you're going to somehow, I think in those sets, the quality of each set is going to have to be progressive so that you go closer to failure at some point in time. And that's going to a lot of times mean for many people, it happened to Dorian Yates, happened to many people I've seen training over the years, that they have to reduce their volume because they can now train harder. But in order, like, let's say you're stuck, you're using, so your first exercise for chest is always incline press, right? And over the years, you've gone from 200 to 225 to 245 to 265, and you're always leaving 3 reps in reserve. And then you get stuck at 265, and you're always stopping 2 or 3 reps in reserve. You could get more reps, right? You could go from a set of 8 to a set of 10 or maybe even 11. But if you just stay at 3 reps in reserve and you're stuck there for a year and you tried changing your volume and everything else, like, you've got sort of one thing available. You can up the stimulus by training with fewer reps in reserve and then make sure you recover from that. Yeah. That's a very viable solution to that. And I think that's something that people will many times, they'll just have to learn how to train harder in that sense. And it may be that your 3 reps in reserve 2 years before is different than your 3 reps in reserve now as well. So you automatically do train harder. Yeah. And you'll still call it 3 reps in reserve. So everyone's got their own little formula, but I think in general, there is something you're leaving in the tank with not training to failure. And it doesn't have to be all your sets either. That's how I set up fortitude training. And
that's the way I would train too, at this point. Yeah. I wonder, you said something, and we should move on too, because we had a bunch of other stuff. But I wonder, you said something, you said, maybe your 3 reps in reserve isn't what it was a couple of years ago. Well, the way I've been looking at it is we're continually redefining failure. I mean, can you continually redefine 3 reps in reserve, just like you continually redefine failure?
I think you need that post, Mark. You need to put the flag down by going to failure at least on occasion. Yeah. Right. Like I know.
I would agree with you, but I wanted to say it out loud to to think it out loud. I suppose you can.
Yeah.
To an I don't know. Yeah, I guess I'm with you. You got to have you got to know what failure is.
Yeah, I mean, a way to do that is like if someone just says, training failure is just not my thing. I know it just becomes too much. Like the benefit to the stimulus to fatigue ratio is just not great for me.
Yeah.
But I want to make sure I'm still being honest on my reps in reserve. Is you just like once every 4, 5, 6 weeks, you just go to failure. Just say, this is it. I'm going to just set of 3 sets with 3 reps in reserve. Today I've got 1 set to failure. I'm going to test myself. And that's what's done in the research studies as well. They redetermine 1 rep max and adjust.
Okay. Yeah.
Oftentimes, not always. A lot of times they do it as traditional reps or traditional progressive overload. Once they can get more than 3 sets in a certain rep range, and they just bump the weight up. But you can redetermine your 1 rep max as you go along, or your failure rep max, so to speak, your rep max for a set.
All right. Well, we got a bunch of stuff here. We do have a bunch of questions, and we had one in particular. I'll be really excited to hear you answer about Skip's proposed training idea. I don't know if you saw Skip talk about that, but I'll tell you about it. Before we do, though, and somebody was asking me about the trip and stuff, so about my jet lag. I'll tell you really quick that jet lag is still a real thing right now, but it's coming together. Yeah, 14-hour time zone difference for 2.5 weeks, plus a 36-hour travel time, 25-hour flight, I believe it was, to get home. Whew, let me tell you, longest flight either of us took, which is saying a lot because, Victoria's done a lot of traveling herself in life. So, yeah, it was crazy, but so worth it. But before we get to our other questions, I wanted to ask you about IGF, because I know, a while back I told you, I was like, hey, Scott, there's a lot of talk about IGF, and then Andrew and I talked about it, and then you started researching it, and now you've put together a 90-minute presentation that's going to be available at the Mountain Dog Diet website. So that'll be coming up real soon. But just as kind of the teaser of that, is it all it's cracked up to be for bodybuilding, and specifically, IGF LR3. I'm really curious about that one, because that's the one that most of us have available. There are guys out there that are using Increlex, including Vigorous Steve. I saw a video. He just got his hands on some, so I'll be curious to see what he has going on with that. And we've talked to other people. You and I have known people that we've talked off the air who had gotten some. Maybe it wasn't enough to really make a big difference, because I think he was splitting it with somebody else. But, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts overall on IGF, and then specifically, on LR3, that is it worth it for bodybuilding? Are we going to is it the magical key that we all have hoped it to be?
I'm sure. Where do I start? There's a lot of that presentation that I put together was just providing background information on IGF-1, IGF-2, the insulin-like growth factor family, which includes insulin. And part of what needs to be understood, I think, are just what are sort of the roadblocks to this actually functioning in some way to produce muscle growth. One thing that's super important there, traditionally people will say there's 6 binding proteins that bind the IGF-1 in particular. There's actually 7, and then there's several lower affinity binding proteins that are involved. These prevent someone, for instance, injecting exogenous IGF-1 and having it just go right to skeletal muscle. In fact, it's going to go everywhere. So there's multiple functions of those, but it's not like you can just, of course, there's serum hormone binding globulin for testosterone, but with testosterone, for instance, or gear, you can put in large amounts relative to the maybe 7 to 10 milligrams of testosterone that's produced, and far exceed the binding ability that we have in our bloodstream to bind that up, right?
Really?
Yeah. So you'll get, you've got so much in the system. Whereas from at least the one study is able to find, humans are producing like 10 milligrams of IGF-1 on a daily basis. More depending on how much you're eating. If you're not eating very much, it goes down. It mainly gets down regulated when you diet, but it does go up a little bit when you overfeed. Of course, someone's using growth hormone, they're going to have IGF-1 that could double, maybe triple. Depends on their nutritional status. But we've got all these binding proteins. And if you think about 10 milligrams being what the body produces in total, at least from my systemic levels here, For someone to try to like just double that with exogenous IGF-1, I don't know how many thousands of dollars that would cost. It costs a lot.
Okay.
Because you're not getting the kind of doses. Just as a side thought too, there are dwarfs. So dwarfism can be caused by lack of growth hormone and also potentially lack of IGF-1 or lack of a functional IGF-1 receptor. So some forms of growth hormone are treated with IGF-1 if they don't have a functioning IGF-1 response. So actually what is done in some of these forms of growth or dwarfism is that they put in IGF-1 with IGF-1 binding protein 3. Those two things are combined to increase the total amount of IGF-1 in your bloodstream, because that's what IGF-1 binding protein 3 in particular does, is it lengthens the half-life.
Can we get that?
Yeah, I'm sure you could find it. They're prescribing it. But whether that would work for our purposes. So the first half of what I talk about there is that we've got systemic IGF-1. I'll try to narrow myself here because there's so much there. And then what pretty much is, at least what's going on endogenously in the normal way in which IGF-1 is exerting its effects on muscle growth, it's a local phenomenon.
Okay.
I go through a bunch of evidence sort of supporting this idea, but it's really a local phenomenon. So it's IGF-1 being produced by skeletal muscle cells after they've been injured or after mechanical stress that we've invoked with the training. And then you've got autocrine and paracrine action. So the IGF-1 actually is released from the muscle cell, and then it acts on itself or it acts on the local satellite cells. That would be paracrine. So it's acting as kind of a local hormone. That's what's going on in terms of IGF-1 with muscle growth. It's going to have anabolic actions. Interestingly enough, we have IGF-1 receptor, there's an IGF-2 receptor, and there's an insulin receptor. The IGF-1 receptor and the insulin receptor are both dimers. There's two pieces to make a fully functioning receptor. And there's also mixed heterodimers. So there's receptors that are half IGF-1 receptor, half insulin receptor.
Kidding.
There's a particular animal model where they knocked out the IGF-1 receptor. Most of the time when you do that, you don't get normal growth from the animals. But in this case, and this was in this particular mouse model, they did pretty much normal muscle growth. And interestingly enough, when they used compensatory hypertrophy, so they took out the soleus, they took out either the gastroc or the soleus, and in this case they looked at the plantaris muscle. That muscle grows really, really well when you do that. They walk around, the muscle compensates for the missing muscle. Yeah. It grew just as well without a functional IGF-1 receptor as with one.
No kidding. Matter.
So that's just one interesting piece. But the thing that made me think of that study was that those animals, although they only knocked out the IGF-1 receptor, they also didn't have, they basically were diabetic. They didn't have a functioning insulin receptor either.
Okay.
So one mechanism, I think I mentioned this in the talk, but one mechanism that's interesting is that IGF-1 binds the insulin receptor, and insulin binds the IGF-1 receptor. And depending on the individual, a lot of those receptors are a heterodimer. They're half IGF-1, half insulin. In this case, when they knocked out the IGF-1 receptor, there was no functional insulin sensitivity in these animals. So that just tells me that at least in some cases, what insulin might be doing is acting through IGF-1 receptor, and vice versa. We know that IGF-1 increases can make you go hypo.
Absolutely.
It binds the insulin receptor, and it may just be binding those heterodimer receptors that are half and half. So we've got we got situations where you can, for instance, in one really, really cool study, they injected with a viral vector the gene for IGF-1, so it would be overexpressed in that same plantaris muscle. So that muscle then became an overproducer of IGF-1, and just in doing that, it grew. Right? It got bigger because it had extra IGF-1, and it just got bigger because it turned on those growth processes. These were in growing animals. But on the other hand, one particular study, if you knock down systemic IGF-1 by like 80%, so the stuff in the blood that people measure is like, oh, I'm using growth hormone and my IGF-1 went up 100%. Like, okay, right. I've got good stuff. You can, in this animal model, you can drop that down to 20%, basically to starvation levels, and they grow muscle just as well when they climb ladders. They grow muscle just as well. Or you can eliminate the insulin-like growth factor 1 receptor, the local receptor, and they grow muscle just as well under this particular stimulus. So the long and short of that is that IGF-1 does play a role. If you got more of it, you get better growth, right? But we've got a redundancy here, right? The system isn't relying upon just this one key IGF-1 for muscle growth. It's not the end all be all for muscle growth. So there's some, you can have people who are diabetics who can live for years that way.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
So without IGF-1 or a functioning IGF-1 receptor, you can have, without its effects, then you can have muscle growth. But if you have more of it, it seems to help. So now we'll go back to people wanting to use IGF-1 or inject IGF-1. First, if it goes into a skeletal muscle, it's going to stay there for some period of time. It's going to have, depending on if you use IGF-1 or IGF-1 LR3 or DES-1,3 IGF-1, actually you have you have a decent half-life for those two, the LR3 and the DES, but it's reduced compared to IGF-1 in the serum,
really?
At least.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
People kind of say the opposite. It's like, in fact, if you look it up on Wikipedia, you'll see there's like a 34-hour half-life, which is, and if you follow that citation, it takes you another paper where they just say it and they don't cite it anywhere.
Okay.
So I found some papers where they actually there's some measurements there in animals in this case.
Yeah.
What, interestingly enough, happens, the purpose of those drugs is to diminish binding affinity to the binding proteins so that you've got free IGF-1.
Okay.
So let's say you inject it into a muscle, you're still going to have a half-life and it's going to be around for a while, but it's going to simply diffuse out of that muscle, right? You've got a concentrated bolus there in the muscle, but this is water-based stuff. So you don't have a situation like with a steroid where you've got a long ester that kind of holds it there in place, right? So as to how fast it leaves that site, don't know for sure. If you could keep it there, that's what you want, because you want elevated levels. In this particular study where the viral vector, they increased expression, that was a continuous, constantly turned on overexpression of IGF-1 in that muscle. And they documented that previously. So they injected right into that muscle.
Yeah.
And this is kind of what was, I won't say the word, there's a certain vaccination that was supposed to work this way.
Oh, yeah.
But it didn't work out that way, apparently. But in this case, this they've documented that you can inject in that muscle, and then you have local overexpression of IGF-1. But when you inject one LR3 or DES-1,3, it's going to stay there for some period of time, but then it's going to diffuse away.
Yeah.
And then one of the issues, of course, with that, and this has to be said, is IGF-1 is very, very prominently involved with cancer progression.
Yeah.
It's a major stimulus for mitosis, and it's a major target for many types of anti-cancer strategiges.
Absolutely.
Right? IGF-1 doesn't seem to be, or and growth hormone, they don't seem to be directly genotoxic, meaning they're not going to turn on cancer that wasn't there already. The issue is if you have a pre-existing cancer that you might not know about, and let's say you inject IGF-1 in a muscle that you want to grow, that IGF-1 is going to diffuse probably relatively rapidly. But I don't know for sure. It doesn't bind to the binding proteins, but it does have a prolonged half-life, actually. So maybe it takes some time to get out of there. Like I said, there's tons of binding proteins. So what exactly it's going to and what's being bound to is somewhat of a mystery as far as what I could dig up. But it's going to go everywhere. It's meant to not bind to those binding proteins. And once it gets into the bloodstream, it's going to make its way to all the tissues in the body. It's going to be everywhere. Okay. Right? So if you've got a tumor growing on your liver, let's say, or you've got prostate cancer that's on its way, the IGF-1 is going to make its way there, the DES or the LR3, because it's meant not to bind to those binding proteins. It's meant to be free.
Organs?
To bind to its receptor.
What
Organs
about
everywhere.
Yeah.
It's every place. Yeah.
Yeah.
IGF-1 gut or growth hormone gut or gear gut or whatever.
So they used to, back in the day, they would say with IGF LR3 to, use it bilaterally, then whatever muscle you trained. I got away from that, but then I would do one day one shot in that shoulder and then the other day in that shoulder kind of thing. You know what I mean? So I still, it evened out. I just, one day I got it here, one day I got it there kind of thing. But it sounds like there is some reality to that, not as effective as like actual like Increlex IGF, but there is still going to be value to localized administration.
in an ideal sense, at least from the literature, what's happening is the IGF-1 is being produced locally after you train.
Which I didn't know that. That blows my mind.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that was the first thing that I caught. Yeah.
This is what's interesting. If you look, for instance, at the growth hormone literature, we see that when you give growth hormone, it doesn't enhance muscle growth. In younger but not older individuals, at least from the one study that I was able to dig up, humans in this case, you give growth hormone and you get an local IGF-1 production. So this is all, it's called the somatomedin hypothesis. It's been around for forever. So during growth and development, especially, growth hormones stimulates the liver to produce IGF-1.
Okay.
As well as bone and muscle and other tissues. So
I did not know that.
The release, yes. That's why a lot of times, if you don't have a functioning IGF-1 receptor, you don't get normal growth.
Okay.
Growth hormone used to be called somatomedin C. Now it's growth hormone. That was what you look up, really look some older studies from like the 90s and before, they just called it somatomedin C. So the somatomedin hypothesis is that growth hormone's effects on growth and development, your skeleton, et cetera, as in a growing individual, juvenile or an infant, child, et cetera, is mediated by IGF-1. So if you knock out IGF-1, growth hormone doesn't have its effect on growth.
That makes sense.
So you can be an IGF-1 dwarf, so to speak. So you don't have effective IGF-1. Maybe you have a defect in that gene for IGF-1, or you have a defective receptor, and you won't get growth. In this animal model, they end up having pretty close to normal muscle growth, just developmentally. But they also got normal muscle growth when they did the compensatory hypertrophy. So the thing is, and I have a slide or two where I go into this, is you've got the satellite cell story that I've talked about so much, right? So as muscles grow, satellite cells are there. They're activated. They undergo mitosis, and then they differentiate. So then they can become new nuclei in the growing muscle cell. And the muscle cell needs more nuclei, according to this nuclear domain theory, to get bigger.
Yeah.
And IGF-1 is involved there, in both of those stages. IGF-2 is involved there as well. We've also got hepatocyte growth factor that's involved there. We've got numerous other growth factors that are involved, or myogenic differentiation factors that are involved in the cells. So it's a very, very complex phenomenon. So, and there are numerous points in that progression of satellite cell activation where IGF-1 is involved, but there are also other things that are involved. So it's sort of like there's a backup strategy in terms of that progression, because it's an important mechanism of adaptation. That's why it's likely that if you don't have insulin-like growth factor 1 that is working because the receptor is missing, you can still get muscle growth. There's one particular study too suggesting that you can get muscle growth with you need the IGF-1 in order to get an increase in satellite cells. So there's something to say for that too. But here's the problem. You inject the IGF-1.
Mm-hmm.
Also, when you have a stimulus, training, IGF-1 is produced, but local binding proteins are also produced. Okay. So it's kind of like, it's sort of like, okay, we release the hounds, right? But the hounds are on a leash, right? And the leash are the binding proteins, and those moderate to what extent IGF-1 is going to be active. The idea in general is that the binding protein prevents full activation. It prevents it from binding to the receptor.
Oh, okay.
However, it's more complicated than that. It's not that easy. Some of those binding proteins have their own actions. They can either inhibit, as I just sort of mentioned, or they can potentiate the actions.
Okay, that's what I wondered. Yeah.
There's also, interestingly enough, and this is, I just found some cool. So when in the cell, when insulin-like growth factor 1 is being produced before it's exocytosed from the cell, before it goes out to act on the cell itself, which is an interesting thing, right? Because all the cells are all kind of communicating. So the cell produces IGF-1, which is released and then comes back and acts on itself. So it's an autocrine function. So it releases its own growth factor, which comes back and acts on it and acts on the local cells. So they're all the neighbors are releasing their hounds at the same time, all the muscle cells. So there's some coordination in the hound hunt, but they're on leashes. Let's make some kind of electronic leash. That's the binding proteins.
Okay.
Also, and this is another potential for variability, because this is the main thing with IGF-1 is, does it work or does it not? There's also something called an E protein that gets produced with IGF-1. So the E protein, so it's kind of like it's like your dog is a German Shepherd, but also there's a little Chihuahua that comes along when you release them, and you're like, well, look at the German Shepherd going out and raising Cain, but there's also a Chihuahua, and the Chihuahua itself can produce the E proteins, have an effect as well, independent, and people don't even measure or pay attention to that. So normally you do release, so maybe the Chihuahua like goes under the little bushes, and if you're hunting rabbits, it cheers the German Shepherd can't go there, but that's important, because that has its own effect on muscle hypertrophy, which,
Holy
interestingly
crap.
enough,
We're not even measuring that. We
Not
aren't
even
measuring
that.
any of this stuff except for just
The binding
like
protein. So, yeah, so
we check IGF.
release,
we check our like serum IGF and GH levels.
Right.
That's it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So if you inject IGF-1, LR3, or what have you, you've got differential. For instance, IGF-1, LR3 does not bind as well to the IGF-1 receptor as IGF-1 increlex.
Okay, that's good to know.
What you see, it's interesting, because what you see is in vitro, when they have in cells that produce these binding proteins, and then you add to that culture IGF-1 and compare it to IGF-1 LR3. What you see then is that LR3 works better in turning on mitosis, doing all the things it does to these cells.
Because it's not getting bound up.
Because it's not getting bound up, right?
Dang. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
But on the other hand, there's one particular, it was with chick embryo cells, and those cells, for whatever reason, they don't produce the binding proteins. And there was no advantage of IGF-1 versus IGF-1 BP3, LR3. I mean, yeah. So, and that's because the binding proteins, there was no advantage to the LR3 because there are no binding proteins that were binding up its competitor IGF-1 in this particular study. I also found, interestingly enough, there's two other things that the variability. I'm sort of spilling a little the beans here, but I'm having fun with this, so let's just roll with it.
Well, we can stop at any point. We have like 20 questions too, but I'm fascinated by this as well. And I'm going to have really to sign back up over at Mountain Dog because I have to hear the whole thing. And I hope you guys do too.
Definitely would. So I found like this variability story. So when you have animal studies, those animals, they're all from the same, all the rats, they're very, very genetically homogeneous, right? From the same litter. There's going to be some variability, but when you're looking at humans, you've got a whole different deal. You've got a lot of heterogeneity. That's why we see responders, non-responders. Just like we're talking about in the context of reps and reserve. We've got psychological variability. We've got biological, physiological variability. There's one particular study where they were measuring tissue dialysate, so tissue measures of IGF-1 production post-exercise. And they measured at the beginning and the end of a training program. This was out of Bill Kramer, a guy named Lindell, who's done a lot of this stuff. There's labs kind of work together on this study. And they found, as you would expect, that IGF-1 was being produced in response to the training stimulus. And the funny thing is, normally they don't measure IGF-1 because it's all bound up to these proteins. What they do is they measure IGF-1 mRNA. So the signal for the genetic signal to produce IGF-1 in the cells, but when you try to measure IGF-1, like it's all bound up, right? You can't measure it.
Yeah, okay.
It's not free. But in this case, they were measuring the dialysis, so the interstitial levels, what's going on outside the cells, what's been released and supposedly doing its deal. And there was no difference pre and post training. But what they found at the beginning of training is that there was a pretty homogeneous response in terms of what they measured. But at the end of training, there was a highly variable response, right? So something happened variably, beginning of training versus the end of training. Part of the training adaptation was a variability, was the evolution of variation in IGF-1, free IGF-1 in the tissue.
Yeah.
And they got to have another study coming out because they didn't even report the muscle growth, any of this kind of stuff. So I want to know what I'm interested to see because this study was just published in 2022, is if that variability in tissue IGF-1, which was only evident in the trained state, was predictive of muscle growth over the course of the training. And we have things like variation in protein synthesis.
Yeah.
That predicts training only if you measure it after 2 or 3 weeks of training, when that initial muscle soreness is gone, after the repeated bout effect has taken place. So maybe we've got a situation here where part of what can determine whether someone's a responder or non-responder is the extent to which their local IGF-1 system gets upregulated and they get a better local IGF-1 response. We know that in terms of other growth factors, and we've seen that in other studies. I think this study may actually confirm that as well. So, but what we don't know is, like, maybe there's an alteration in the binding proteins get released from those muscle cells that are being trained. Maybe, maybe something to bind up those binding proteins instead of IGF-1, would make sense. Like that, and that may be the issue with some people. They get plenty of IGF-1, but their binding proteins are excessive. Or maybe they've got the wrong ones because there's so many of them that are released from muscle as well.
And that could explain when we've talked about how some people are responders and some people are non-responders to, well, that would be to growth hormone. But in turn, you're getting an IGF-1 release from that. And from what you're saying, the growth hormone isn't what's doing the growth. The IGF is. So when we talk about like who's a good responder to growth hormone, could we say that a possibility may be related to what their binding proteins are for IGF?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the growth hormone does stimulate local IGF-1 release, at least in young people. This study, not in older individuals.
So it won't happen for me. You're saying, like, for you or
you're not that old yet. Yeah, no.
Oh,
yeah.
No. Oh, no.
I'm probably getting there.
Okay.
You're young. You're young still in the research context.
Why? Okay.
You're a whippersnapper.
I'll take it.
Young McNally. Yeah. So yeah, to the extent to which growth hormone, your genes for the growth hormone receptor, exon 6, whether it's there or not, I think is the thing that's variable in the growth hormone gene, or maybe the GH that you're using, is it farm grade, is it non-farm grade?
Right.
How many fragments are there? Has it been all the modifications that can happen in packaging or in processing and then sending the thing. That to the extent to which that impacts local IGF-1 is interesting.
Okay.
That can be variable as well. Another study, these are the two that I dug up, and this was an interesting one. So they took muscle samples they were all women who were undergoing, I think, bariatric surgery. So they were getting a bariatric surgery done where they tie off the stomach, gastric bypass surgery. Maybe they could also put a ligament in there, a ligature in there, something of that sort. And they biopsied, I think, the rectus abdominis muscle, and they cultured those muscle cells. So they created a muscle culture from the satellite cells that were there. And then they exposed those, and they compared the effect. And of course, these are muscle cells that are going to produce the binding proteins. They're fully functional. They compared IGF-1 to IGF-1 LR3.
Okay.
And all the animal research would suggest that IGF-1 LR3 is going to work better because it doesn't bind to those binding proteins.
I say yes because that's more affordable. Like most everybody here, I think Chris up here was like, "Oh my God, please don't tell me that this is the best thing because I'll never afford it."
Yes, may become a no here because what they found is that there was no difference in the human cells.
Okay.
Yeah, but it was highly variable. And I pulled the quote. It's like they just sort of mentioned this. It was highly variable among individuals. So some people there was a difference, and some people there wasn't. And this had to do with the biology of their muscle cells, and the way in which they respond, and the way in which they produce binding proteins, or the constitutive binding proteins that were being produced, and the way in which they did or didn't bind up the IGF-1.
I would love to see a study, or not really a study, but I'd love to see some experiments where we took somebody that's like a bodybuilder who is like, yeah, I've gotten my best gains from growth hormone and IGF. I'd love to get their binding proteins tested versus another guy who says, I didn't get anything out of it.
So many things. The thing too is like systemic IGF-1 is responsive to growth hormone. It's also responsive to testosterone, and those things synergize.
What do you mean responsive?
You get more IGF-1 obviously with growth hormone. And testosterone can also increase it as well. And your diet can increase it.
Oh yeah.
So you take someone, and here's like another thought that I threw out there. I'm sort of dumping all the beans here, but there's still a lot in this talk. But the other thought is that if systemic does matter, because systemic is varying according to your nutritional status, especially when you diet down, your IGF-1 will go down. And part of that is because that IGF-1 that's systemic is going in and regulating energy turnover, the anabolic state of the cells, right? So one of the things that IGF-1 does on a whole body level is it turns down anabolism. So you're not trying to build up tissue when there's no calories, there's no nutrition available. It's responsive to both protein availability and energy availability. And it goes down substantially when, like, if you, in one study I found they fasted for like 5 days and it was down to like 40% of normal after 5 days.
Okay.
And it took a while to come back up. And it was variable depending whether they had protein or energy. Protein and energy was better. But if you overfeed and eat excessive calories, you do get an increase in IGF-1. So you have someone, let's say, who normally think, systemic IGF-1 doesn't really make a difference. In the studies with, regular training, there's no correlation between the IGF-1 elevation you get after training and muscle growth, right? There's something that happens there, but it's not like this is what's causing the muscle growth. It's that local IGF-1 that matters, okay? So now we're getting into a natty versus enhanced type of thing, and this is just a wild ass guess type of theory that I thought might be part of what people are experiencing. But you take someone now who's your typical IGF-1 user. They've already got everything else in play, right? They're eating in excess. They've got a caloric excess, which is going to elevate IGF-1 to some degree systemically. They've got 10 IUs of farm-grade growth hormone in there, or 5 or whatever. They're using growth hormone. That's elevating IGF-1. And they've got 2 grams of Kir in there. Yeah. That's going to probably elevate their IGF-1. So now maybe at some point you start to get to some threshold level where the IGF-1 levels systemically in your blood relative to your binding protein or your total binding capacity and all the binding proteins that are there is getting to where now you may have some threshold level where your tissue levels in the muscle that you're training is starting to supersede the binding protein capacity there. And you are actually elevating local IGF-1 in the muscles that you've trained because you got all this other stuff just increasing IGF-1 all over in your body.
Yeah.
And then you add IGF-1 to it extra. And you go with a high, I've seen people suggest you got to use like 5 milligrams, which is about half the
kidding
production.
me.
That's a lot. I saw that suggested on a board. I won't say any names, but when you look at 10 milligrams a day being your endogenous production, we're trying to, it's not like if you produce, 10 milligrams of testosterone a day, right? Well, you can blast just putting in, that's 100 milligrams a week. You go on a gram a week, you're 10 times above that.
Yeah.
You've way superseded the normal operating range for testosterone. But to way supersede the normal operating range for IGF-1, you'd have to spend $1,000 a day on Increlex or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So the idea with these dwarf studies is that they're just trying to replenish IGF-1 that's completely missing. It's not working for whatever reason. So they can kind of do that. I don't know. I should look closely what I was running out of time. This thing was 90 minutes. It was supposed to be 15. So I had to make it a 2-month thing. Yeah. So I had to eventually just stop and just get it out.
Yeah.
Because the month is coming to an end. But my thought would be, you might be someone who's like you're getting to that threshold where now you're increasing tissue levels in a way that where IGF-1 can make a difference.
Yeah.
Relative to all these other players in this sequence of events where IGF-1 is involved. And then you add IGF-1 to it, then you might get something new. But you also you've also increased IGF-1 levels in all those other tissues too, more than likely, because it's going to diffuse throughout the body. So now you maybe also incrementally increase the risk of a cancer that hasn't yet come about, but may be more likely to because your liver's taxed, your prostates, get a nice androgenic.
Rhonda Patrick suspected that. She had said she thought that long-term use by athletes may eventually cause a cancer that you wouldn't have otherwise had down the road. She's like, we don't know, but 10 years down the road, she said, I could see it being a possibility.
The evidence, for instance, with, and I don't know this literature, there was a nice review that I found, so I just kind of looked into this. Like I said, I had to eventually kind of shut it down, but like with acromegaly patients who have elevated growth hormone for their entire life, they don't seem to have a higher incidence of cancer, but when they do get cancer, it seems like it progresses more rapidly.
I bet.
That's kind of the bottom line. So it's not like the IGF-1 is going to cause cancer, but let's say you have a cancer that you might have caught early. That's the thing with cancer, is catching it at an early stage.
Yeah.
And you're pushing and you're gaining weight, and everything else, and all you're focused on, because now you've got all your eggs in that basket is growing and growing.
Yeah.
And a cancer, does come about. Maybe it's brought on by the other things that you're doing. And IGF-1 is there to just hurries up the progress of the cancer, the progression of the cancer. So now you could end up, not necessarily with the cancer, and she might be right too. Like, years and years of IGF-1, there aren't many people who are doing that because it's so expensive. But 10 years, we don't have those values. And I have to go, you could compare what 2 milligrams of IGF-1 per day would be like compared to someone with acromegaly. But it in of itself doesn't seem to be genotoxic. It doesn't evoke a new cancer, but it certainly is very likely to cause one to progress more rapidly, from what I understand in looking at the literature. So
okay, well, listen, do you got time for some questions, Scott? Because people are asking us a bunch of questions.
Okay.
Let's see. So you mentioned the jet lag thing already. I'll just start from the top here. Matt Blevins had asked, so this was, he asked us all the way at the beginning if he's still with us. He said you bought the he says hydro powder. It was a hydrolyzed beef collagen from True Nutrition. That's what I use. Like I said before, use our code THINK. It's really too, I've compared their pricing to what you can get in the grocery store. It's the best price. Like, it's flat out the best price. What they end up doing in the grocery store products is they give you those little tiny scoopers, and they tell you, here's a serving, versus the True Nutrition. Yeah, it's 10 grams versus a scoop from True Nutrition is 30. I've been using 20, by the way, now. I met somebody at the Olympia who was with Rick Collins, actually, and he had done research on, I think like his whole dissertation was about collagen. And he had said that 15, 20 grams is the sweet spot that everybody really could benefit from. So I backed it down. I was using 30 per Dante's suggestion after I tore my supraspinatus, and I did that for like a year and a half. But I've backed it down to now to like a half a scoop, 2/3 of a scoop. But we talked about this a little bit before. So you're getting a lot of glycine from hydrolyzed beef collagen, and it's not going to be it's not going to have the same complete amino acid chain for muscle growth. But if you were to use that with food, you may be able to then get aminos from that food to make up for it, right?
Yeah, you can make a complete protein if you add that too.
Yeah. So I would count it as protein. He asked if you count it as protein. I'd say, you count it as protein.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if you're thinking on a meal by meal basis, and let's say, you wake up and that's your one protein source for, you wake up fast, you throw it in your coffee, then you don't eat anything for 3 or 4 hours. That's not going to be an adequate protein source to turn on protein synthesis or maintain it in the way that a complete protein source would be. If you're mixing that in, with other protein sources throughout the day, then that would add in. So there's sort of, you're totally right in what you're saying. And total protein is important, and you want to have high quality. But let's say that half your protein was whey protein and half your protein was collagen protein. And if you added that all together, you would have a certain amount of essential amino acids, and you might actually eventually at some point, when you mix in more collagen protein, you degrade the protein biological value, the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. Eventually it goes down. If you go to 3/4 collagen, but if you just have that one window where it's just the collagen protein, that's not the best protein. All in all, it probably is not going to it's not like all of a sudden you're going to start shrinking if you do that. So it might, a thing I wonder is, the thing about the collagen protein is you can follow those amino acids, although I think a study came out recently that suggested that those, as other studies have demonstrated, that those collagen-based amino acids end up in connective tissue, collagen fibers. That isn't necessarily the case. I'll see if I can find that. I saw it.
Oh, really?
I think I put it in my database. Yeah, I came across somewhere. But maybe to some degree, you need a background of high quality protein to just turn on protein synthesis in general in those tissues. You're going to supply the specialized building blocks in terms of the collagen protein, but you also want to have some essential amino acids in there. So, like, I mean, here's a supplement idea for someone who wants to have, I give away all my good ideas, right? But maybe you add essential amino acids to a collagen protein.
There you
So
go.
you fill out the protein digestibly correct amino acid score, bring it up to 100 or the biological value, however you want to look at it. And now you've got a complete protein that's collagen based. So it's your collagen protein that you would include, after your workout if you wanted to, if you feel like you need that for an injury recovery or what have you.
Yeah, but I just moved mine to with my first meal now. So, and I've
there you
got
go. That's
protein
perfect.
in that.
There you go. Problem solved.
So here was a question that I thought would be interesting to talk to you about. Wanted to know your opinion on Skip trying to work out every other week. So here's what he has going on. He took a long break. I think he had pulled something. When he got back to the gym, he felt like $1,000,000, and he likes to train hard. Skip doesn't want to compromise with the way he trains. So he was thinking to himself, what if I were to do what I like, train the way I like training, and train for a week and then take an entire week off and then come back? Because he said every time he's ever come back after taking a break, he feels like $1,000,000. Joints are better. I can relate to all that,
Yeah.
And pumps are good. Workouts are the best. So I'm sure, knowing Skip, that he's probably Skip's a guy who will do a little bit too much versus a little bit too little. I'm sure he's always been in a perpetually overtrained state to some degree or another, and those breaks are probably been great for him. So now, what do you think about this idea? My main thought is this: I feel like Skip's so 100% when he's on, but then he's 100% off when he's off. Like, he doesn't follow a diet or anything. So I think just knowing him, the biggest challenge is going to be still eating in a regimented bodybuilder way, still being healthy on that week off. But if he can do that, which I'm excited to see if he can do that, he's going to try this after Swiss, by the way.
Okay.
This is going to be his game plan. Let's say from a muscle growth point of view, what do you think of this?
There's some scientific evidence, and obviously he has his empirical evidence. I think it could very possibly work. The thing I can imagine happening, just sort of thinking globally now, is that it's going to work for a while, and then eventually, whatever fatigue he's recovering from that's accumulated over the months and years beforehand, eventually he'll be recovered, and that may not work as well.
Oh.
So what's interesting, because there's a bunch of things that come into my head, of course, but one of which is that we have the satellite cell idea too. This is why I think many pros, the best bodybuilders in the world, they train with the bro split, with a week's rest in between, as opposed to the higher frequency, because you turn on that satellite cell progression, it takes 5, 6, 7 days to be complete. So he may be able to set those adaptations in motion during the 1 week, and then literally, depending on what his training regimen is. So let's say he does trains everything twice in 1 week.
I think he's going to train everything once. I thought it was everything
just once. Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
So he'll have then 2 weeks in between. There's a study out of,
but that's
yeah. I mean, the question is then, what's the optimal time in between? Up to a week works really well for lots of people, right?
Yeah.
Some of the best people, because this satellite cell story kind of makes sense of that. There's also this study out of Norway. It was a blood flow restriction study, and they trained the bejesus out of it was a power lifter for 7 or 10 days. I can't remember the exact protocol. And then they gave him a week off, and then he came back and did it again. And then they just followed. They did muscle biopsies, and they found a delayed muscle growth that happened 20 days after the last training session.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Huh.
But they trained it was twice a day. Blood flow restriction training, I think, is what they did.
Yeah.
It was really, really brutal. It's something you never do. So they intentionally sort of produced what, if they went much longer, it would have definitely been overtraining.
Yeah.
But a delayed hypertrophic adaptation that takes weeks to manifest has been documented in the literature.
No kidding.
So that's out there. Yeah. And at least in this case study. And this is what I see with fortitude training. This is why I, put some periods, some time of no training in there. Is all of that's based on autoregulation. The way I set up the progressive blast intensive cruise, Dante had blasting crews. I just stole his terms and gave him credit, right? And the idea is that you have to be able to auto-regulate and know when to stop. So how far have you pushed? Are you in a functional overreaching situation where if you stop and then you recover enough that you will functionally overreach and come back stronger and bigger? Or are you in a non-functional overreach? And we didn't actually overtrain technically, but when you, regardless of how much you recover, you just never come back stronger. You just went too hard, or whatever other your dietary, your recovery circumstances where you're just not going to come back stronger and better. So it's non-functional. Didn't serve your purposes. And there's overtraining where you just went too far, and then you just need to take a break. If you really overtrain, you just need to stop. Yeah. But that's all based on being able to auto-regulate. And just give some perspective, like with Dante, with DC training, he would just tell people, and this is smart, I really think it's smart, is like, hey, if you feel like you just need 2 weeks off, take 2 weeks off. Don't do anything. Okay. That would work for some people. Otherwise, he would suggest, reducing your weights, like I think 30%, and leaving several reps in reserve and just go light training for a couple weeks. And what I was kind of finding is that it was highly variable. Some people would come back better. Some people would come back and they're screwed. There was a study that just came out where they had 2 groups and they trained them, I think, for one group trained for 9 weeks progressive overload and took a complete week off. It was a deload study, and then they trained for another 9 weeks, and the other group just trained straight through. And in some of the measures, and I'm not going to say the wrong thing, but basically that week off did not didn't help.
Okay,
they end up lagging behind in terms of their adaptations. And that's what happens sometimes with DC training. People would take 2 weeks off and do nothing. They're like, shit, they'd come back weaker than they were at the end of their last blast. It would take half of the next blast to come back. But that was an inappropriate deload.
Yeah.
And Ken, of anybody I can think of who's been at it, like as long as I have, we've both been training like 40 years, right? Ken's exactly 6 months older than me for what it's worth.
Is he really?
He's exactly 6 months older. Yeah. So I kind of know his birthday, because it looks like a half year off of mine. He's going to be able to auto-regulate and know if this is going to work because he's got the experience to do it and he knows how he trains. So if there's anyone who's going to be able to pick out what seems like a strange strategy like that might work for a while, and he'll know when it stops working, because this is very much like what happens with skip loading. He's used to seeing this pattern. You do a skip load, and I don't want to bastardize this. I think I got it right this time, but he does a skip load. Everyone gains a bunch of weight. That's the thing. Your weight goes up. You come back on a Monday after a Sunday skip load, and your weight's up by 5 pounds. And then what he does is he watches to see over the course of the week when you get back to your previous weight. And then you want to get, if you're dieting down, of course, you want to get a little bit below that.
Yeah.
Right. And so progressively. So if you overdo the skip load, or you never get back to your baseline, and then you do another skip load, well, your weight on average is going up.
Right.
It should be end up going down over time. So each skip load should be engaged with typically I think he just does time and maybe the macronutrient. But how he engages that is based on how your weight tapers back down week by week. So he's got years and years, decades of watching his weight and his strength and everything vary on a weekly basis because he's doing this with skip loading. So if anyone's going to know that a 1 week on and 1 week off works really well, it's going to be skip, because he's done that. He's been injured enough times to have seen that, and he's so used to framing things in terms of week-long changes in this way. Like that's the lens he's using to view his training and his diet and everything, that he's been, he's an expert with that perspective, that magnifying glass on training. So I can totally see it working for him as long as he's pushing really, really hard, and maybe even invoking kind of like a functional overreaching during those weeks. And then when he takes the week off, I had 2 experiences. Well, I had one that I documented with when I truly overtrained, but the one that was sort of the most salient in my mind was when I was in high school. And I think I've talked about this before on this podcast. I was in high school, and I did everything that we were supposed to do. So like the summer before my junior year, I was on the swim team. So I had swim practice, and I was doing this weight training regime, which I talked about, which was just asinine. It was 3 times a week, full body, 98 sets total per workout. We did every exercise in the gym. I found it. I just dug out a bunch of stuff. I was cleaning up my house. I found a bunch of stuff, and I saved this. And you would pick a weight you could get 8 reps with, and then and you wait 1 minute, and the next set you could get 7 or 8 reps, but not like more. And then the next whatever. So 2 out of 3 sets were to failure. So I was doing 65, 66 sets to failure 3 times a week, full body. It was squats, leg presses, hack squats, knee extensions, hamstring curls, seated calf raises, standing calf raises, donkey calf raises, pull downs, bent over rows, Beneful Smith machine rows, cable rows, pull downs to the front, pull downs to the rear. Like it's 98 sets of every exercise.
Literally, right? Yeah, every machine in the gym. Some of them used twice. Thing. Yeah,
I was the only one who did it. You had to go in there. The gym was open from 8. This was in the summertime. Open from 8 to noon. I had to be there right at 8 so
to
I
get
could
it
be
finished
by noon to get it done.
Oh my God!
I have to warm up sometimes, and it's 98 sets. So you think 98. So there's 98 minutes in between, and plus, like let's say roughly a minute for the sets. So that's that's like 200 minutes. Yeah. Right. And that's 3 hours right there. Plus, time in between. So I had to bust ass. And then after that, I would go. We had agility drills to do. So I do karaoke and sprints and zigzags and form running. And I was on both offense and defensive. So I would do the running back drills and I do the linebacker drills. And then there was some optional drills that I would do, of course, because hey, why not? And then there was an endurance run, and you could do an optional longer one. So I would go and run 2 or 3 miles. Mm-hmm. It was extra. And I didn't eat anything. I get up in the morning.
Oh God, you do all this fasted.
And I go home and then I eat, and then I go to swim practice. Oh, man. And then I go to play passing league. So like an hour and a half of running around.
Dude, that's nuts.
So I did that all summer long, right? Yeah. And then we went into our season. We went through 2-a-days, which were just brutal. And then we did we had our first game, and then the second game I got injured, right? Oh. Totally knocked out, thigh bruise. And here's what I'm getting to. So I was like way overtrained, probably coming back.
Yeah.
And I got injured and I got sick at the same time. I got totally laid up. I had a thigh bruise, ended up being a myositis ossificans. Oh. So I had literally a chunk of bone that developed. The hemorrhaging was so bad in my quad. And I overdid the rehab, and eventually there was a disc of bone in my quad. You could see it in X-ray.
Oh my God!
But we had transitioned during that first week of the season to like a maintenance lifting regime. So it was just like 2 sets on an incline press, and they had like kind of a pyramid system. Like you go with you do 135, 155, 175, and they're like 10 to 12 reps, and then 8 to 10 reps or whatever. Just a real basic thing. And I'd say I was doing like 175 on incline. I weighed like 160. I was an average sized kid. And I was doing that. I knew where I was because I'd done it a few times. And then I missed a whole week. I didn't do anything. I was super sick. I laid on my butt for an entire week. I felt awful. I was in pain. Yeah. Although I was trying to rehab my leg. I did nothing. And then I limped back in, and I couldn't play. I couldn't run, And I limped back in. And at least I can do the upper body. And I went from like 175 to like 2.25 or 205, and I went from like 10 reps to like 24 reps.
Oh, no kidding.
What is going on? My performance all I did was rest, and I didn't eat. I didn't do anything. I just had a total super rebound because I just way overtrained. I stopped the swimming. I stopped all the running. I stopped the 98 sets 3 times a week, and I was sick. It was the worst situation, but I just rested.
So I wonder too, because Skip's not a younger guy anymore, right? So it's like we'll see. But the way he is too. Like if he's going to try something, he's going to commit to it. So I think at this point it's going to happen. So I'll look forward to seeing what goes on with that. We do have a bunch more here. What about somebody just asked about dealing with loose skin? Do we have any tips on loose skin from weight loss? It's something I've seen it a bunch. And I will tell you this, man. I've seen people whose skin has tightened up miraculously, like even when it's been loose. Like a guy who was 300 pounds, and then he gets into like literally contest shape. And the longer that you stay lean, the better opportunity you have for that fat or for that skin to tighten back up. And sometimes I've seen what has literally been like folds mostly go away. Maybe it's not 100%, but I've seen it mostly go away in some people. I guess a lot of the factors are going to be how fat were you before, Like, was this an all your life thing, or did you just go on a bender for a year because you got a divorce and now you have loose skin because you put on a bunch of weight and now you're lean again? I think that's a factor. And then age is a factor, you know, like the elasticity of your skin, right? As you age isn't going to be as good. But you know, those are things we can't change. I would say hydration is probably a key factor for our skin, right?
Yeah, I've wondered too. Actually, I've wondered about collagen. Speaking of collagen protein, there's different types of collagens. We could go into all of that, and some are more. You find them more so in skin. I think True Nutrition does have like a complete collagen supplement.
Yeah, the hydrolyzed beef collagen, I believe, is the one that Dante suggested. And I'll tell you what, man. So I told my mom about it, and now keep in mind her protein intake was pretty low to begin with. So just getting that in was probably a huge benefit. She uses a scoop a day, 29, 30 grams. And after a few months, the people at her, she does like a jazzercise class or something. And the women at her class who are younger than her, she's older lady now. She's grandma. She's in there with women that are in their 30s. And they started saying, Betty, what are you doing different? You know, what's going on? She started seeing people in the grocery store say, what are your what's your beauty regimen? What do you do?
Oh, that's awesome.
And you can see the difference. She's reverse aging. Victoria's seen it. I've seen it. So much so that I did a year or so ago, I did a little ad for True Nutrition with her because she's such a big fan of it. But it has made a legit difference in the way her skin looks, in her hair quality. Like all of that stuff is drastically improved. I can see it in my skin. I haven't used it for the last couple of months, but when I get consistent with the collagen, which like I said, I just ordered mine back. I was being lazy and I didn't have it. I can see a difference in my skin. The quality of your skin just improves from it. So there's no question in my mind that it makes a difference.
I wonder, like the skin, of course, it got stretched out. It conformed to the greater body fat that you have. And I wonder, for instance, like skin around the waistline that's hanging over, just like, you know, skin that gets stretched when women get pregnant, then they have stretch marks are a whole different story, but they've got loose skin from that. I wonder if wearing some sort of a support, like a waist trainer type of thing to hold skin in place couldn't be an effective strategy.
Really?
Because then that skin is held tight and it's going to reform. Just like skeletal muscle does this too. It will change the number of sarcomeres you'll see in the muscle tissue if it's casted in a shortened position or cast in a lengthened position longer than it typically would be. So there's some remodeling that goes on and I've seen this maybe in when I was doing personal training years ago, and I would do skin folds on people who had a good amount of body fat. And I was always amazed, especially did a lot of these too when I was in school, grad school, and then we had a lab and when I was teaching college courses. And you see someone who's they're bound to determine they're going to wear those same jeans, you know, the size 34 waist or whatever forever. And they've since put on 20 pounds. And you'll actually see people where literally kind of like if you band a tree, and I've used this analogy before here, like you see where their pants are like creating a fold place, or the fat just is going to, it's grown over that. And there's this distinct line there.
Yeah.
And that's from their clothing. Yeah. It just, there's no place for that skin to grow and develop because it's all tight.
Yeah.
So the same thing, I haven't seen any data on this, but I presume it probably could be done, is if you just compress that. And they do this, I'm not an expert on this, but I think they do this with like plastic surgery, gyno surgery. They have guys wear a compression vest.
Yeah.
For that reason, because you just taken out that extra tissue, especially if you're young, and they don't want you not got loose skin there. And if that's just hanging like that, taking out the gynoid tissue, it's going to stay like that. But if you wear the compression vest for however long you're supposed to, the idea is that skin flattens out, and when it's remodeling itself, it'll remodel itself, being more constricted and flattened down. So someone who's losing weight, like wearing a compression garment of some sort to hold that fat in place, makes sense. And then there's also this, that makes sense to me.
I've always heard the opposite though, like that it wasn't going to do anything. But the way you just explained that, it makes total sense, because I've seen that with like the pants thing that you mentioned. I've seen that.
It's great. You like at the pant line, you've got like a 34-inch waist, and then you go above that, and it's like 42 inches. It's like There's a distinct line there. It's like, wow, like that's not. If we were running around, naked like in the course of evolution, the fat would not be, it would not be like
drop.
also drawn in right that. Yeah, it'd be a much more smooth fat distribution across the midsection of the waistline. So there's something that, and then there's this really interesting case study of the guy who ate nothing, like he was like 400 or 500 pounds. It's been published in the literature, and he literally ate nothing. He just took in water and vitamins and minerals to keep himself from going deficient. And he dropped from like, I can't remember. I want to say he was like 400 plus pounds. He dropped down to like the 180s, 190s, and he had no loose skin.
Wow.
But he ate no protein. He ate nothing. He ate no calories.
I remember you telling me about this before.
Yeah.
He just starved himself, but his body fed off itself, huh?
The body fed off itself, and I think it was also driving proteins from his skin, from those connective tissue fibers, the collagen, the elastin, etc. So So what makes me think, this is why I brought up the collagen, is I wonder for someone who is dieting down and you want the collagen there, and we know that protein preserves muscle protein when you diet down. High level, you can use pretty high levels. And if you're someone who's like, well, I'm using all my high level, high biological value proteins, animal-derived proteins to keep my muscle tissue in place, and also want to keep my joints and everything good, so I have all my connective tissue proteins or amino acids that come from my collagen, and you got loose skin on top of that, you may actually be, in the terms of loose skin and whatever of that might be catabolized in the course of a diet, tighten up your skin, like what happened in this case study. You may be doing yourself a disservice if you're preventing skin atrophy by taking in collagen, because you're going to preserve your skin mass as you would preserve your muscle mass. In this case, with connective tissue with collagen proteins that are specific to the skin.
I've wondered about that with dieting down, if it would affect your ability to get that paper thin skin.
Yeah, I mean, we know like growth hormone, for instance.
You got
thicker
exactly.
skin folds and acromegaly, and growth hormone it seems like it may have some effect on people. They don't get that thin skin look if they're using a lot of it.
Yeah.
Some that could be water retention from GH. They don't take it out before they get on stage. But I think there might be something with skin there as well over the years.
That said, I think that you could still keep your growth in, keep your collagen in, and change a lot of other factors and still make progress first, right?
it's a minimum thing. Yeah, but there's variability too. So just the fact that guy came down in like 1 year, like you can't lose weight any faster than that unless you tried to run a marathon every day. Like his caloric deficit was his energy expenditure for the day. It wasn't 500 calories a day. It wasn't 1,000. It was his energy. It was everything, because he ate nothing, no energy.
And he survived
he had no loose skin. He was fairly young. He wasn't a 50, 60-year-old guy. But so that makes me wonder if maybe not having collagen in there, not having collagen protein would be worth it. And then bind the skin up so it's tight. I think that makes a difference. I mean, shit, like I have CPAP lines here because I had a CPAP for 12 years now. Longer than that. And it scrunches your face together. So these lines on my face, I've had those age like 10 years, but that's from having my face scrunched.
I wonder if mine are from that, because I wear a CPAP as well.
Yeah. I mean, I know like Jordan Peters.
He got it big time, didn't he?
He's got it big time. Yeah. And he used to max out his pressure on his CPAP all the time.
I bet he had to. Yeah.
He had to. Yeah. So, and he'd be like, oh my God, look at his face. And like, it happens in like 6 months, right? Your face it's a really dramatic rapid, and then it kind of stays. But, I thought about getting one of the surgeries done.
We got to get the Scott Stevenson waist wrap now. Scott Stevenson, the Fortitude waist wrap for loose skin.
Right.
Let me see what else we have here, because we had
Wastitude. That's it.
Yeah.
The Wastitude wrap.
We got one about when I worked at the pop company, or soda for you guys not in the Midwest or Canada. He said, did you struggle while dieting with the pop company doing manual labor? Working for a moving company now, average 15 to 25K steps per day while dieting. I'll be honest, man, dieting was easy for me. I don't mind being hungry. I don't mind struggling, and I would struggle toward the end. Like, I remember my weakness. Like, I would get weak at work. When you had to break down like an entire pallet of cases. And it's like 2 tons, or no, 2,000 pounds, so about a ton. And then you got 4 of them or 8 of them, and you've got to like break those down and build them into a display or something. And you're on, 3 weeks out from a show or 1 week out from a show, and it's summertime, and you're in a like unair conditioned room while using oral tren. It was bad, man. It was bad. That sucked, dude. That sucked. But
no DNP. No DNP when you?
Yeah, one time. Yeah, I did DNP. It was summertime as well. I remember specifically like sitting in my car and talking to VJ about it and talking about, how ATP gets basically zapped. And I was like, I just can't move, man. I just can't move. But outside of that, I would say the hardest part was growing. Growing was much more difficult because I couldn't get the food up high enough. And eventually I did, when I went to like the 8,000 plus calorie a day diet, but that eventually affected my digestion because I couldn't keep that all clean, and it just was rough on my stomach. I'll honestly say too, since when I did that job, I had given up what I thought would be my career in photography. I got an education in photography and fine art, worked in that industry, moved back home to Michigan, and decided I don't know what I want to do next. So there are some people out there that have a misconception, think that like I was just always a warehouse worker or something. No, that's not what I did. But when I came home, I was like, I don't want to do that anymore. And what do I want to do? I don't know. So I took a job to make money because I still had to like make a living, right? And I did that so I could figure out my life. So it was kind of like an in-between things kind of job. And in that situation, I should have taken a different job to be better at bodybuilding, honestly. I really should have, man. Now,
yeah, that's the hard job.
I formerly worked with a guy who climbed telephone poles for a living and went down in sewers to work on electricity. The dude, sometimes he has 24-hour shifts, and his caloric needs were so high, we had like a cheat meal in every day, and he still had abs, and we're trying to grow. Now for him, it's a career, and the longer he stays there, the better seniority he gets, the less sewers he has to crawl into. It's going to pan out for him. But if you're in a situation like I mentioned I was, get a different job. You know what I mean? Get a job where you don't have to move as much. Ron Partlow loved to sit on a chair as a bouncer. He said he would, sit at the front door. Like, he got that job. That was his job. Yeah. That's what he did. Yeah. He did that, and he did bartending, and it's like, if it's an in-between job, then do something where you don't have to walk around as much. If it's your thing, and that's what you have to do, and that's what your career is, then, so be it. Then you got to do what you got to do, right?
Yeah. Parking lot attendant, something like that,
Yeah, exactly.
There.
What about this one, Scott? At what point you consider doing a mini cut during a long off season for a competitor? I know it's more of a visual thing, but how many weeks of bulking you usually see a need for a mini cut?
If someone, for instance, were doing fortitude training and we decided to do that during the intensive cruise, then it might be like every 6 weeks we might have a period where they're doing kind of a mini cut. There's so many different reasons for doing that and so many different circumstances. So it's a super individual thing. Someone might need just a GI deload, basically.
Yeah.
So and sometimes too, you can literally just, if you're pushing the calories so high, you can literally just make sure you get your protein in and just drop back down to eating according to your appetite. So it's not like you're restricting your food at all.
Yeah.
You're just eating. So if you go from 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day and you drop down to like just 3,000, eat according to your appetite, and you've been stable at 5,000 or 6,000, let's say, and you're not making any gains, then everything, pretty much is set. So that's your caloric balance. You're not going anywhere with that. You change your diet, your activity levels might change some other things, but you're going to incur a pretty substantial caloric deficit just from dropping down to just eating according to appetite. Make sure that it doesn't go too low, but you can do that just to sort of restart the system. But it entirely depends on the person and where they are in their off season.
Yeah.
It might be you go after a show and you can go 4 or 5, 6 months without having to do that. But the next 4 or 5 months, you may have to do it every month for a week to keep going. So it depends on the person, depends on the GI, depends on how much they're working, that sort of thing. Like your guy, the telephone guy, like you probably didn't have to do any mini cuts for him, right?
No, God, no.
Yeah, wasn't even thinking about it. So, but someone who's sitting at a desk job, and they're trying to put on size going beyond what weight they've ever been at, and their GI tends to have issues for whatever reasons, and you're trying to figure that out, you may need to do a mini cut, once a month for a period of time, just for the GI, not necessarily for body fat.
And you might save yourself in the long run, like I found that with people that I've pushed, let's say we're like, okay, we're going to take this year off to grow. We're not going to compete next season. We're going to do 2 whole years. I found that like getting somebody in shape after 2 years of having not dieting is a lot harder than if they had been if they'd been in shape more frequently, more recently, I should say.
Yeah. Yeah, it does give you some insight as to what you're going to have to do when the contest diet comes.
Yeah, yeah.
How fast it comes off, right?
Yeah.
Some people, it's like, okay, we dieted you for 3 weeks there, and you needed like 3 more, and you'd have been in contest shape. So,
yeah.
Okay, that's good. Now we know
Other
that.
people, you pull a bunch of food and like nothing happens. That's, as a coach, that's scary. Then you're like, oh crap, we've got problems.
Yeah. There was I remember at this an Armbrust gym did a seminar with Alan Aragon, Paul Carter.
Yeah.
And there was a woman that came up and asked Alan this because he's the nutrition guy.
Yeah.
And she was a competitor, and she just had a very stingy metabolism in both directions. She could cut her calories, and she would just stay the same, and she could massively overeat, and it just stayed the same. It didn't go anywhere. And she was just perplexed by it. That she just had a system that was like that. It just it had a very, very robust settling point that was guarded against in both directions. So some people are like that.
Yeah. Chris mentioned, he said, I use the ResMed AirFit 30 mask, no lines. It's super soft on the face. I use the ResMed AirSoft 20 mask. AirFit, not AirSoft. That's something else.
Yeah. I use the Mirage Quattro, I think it's called.
That sounds like a razor.
It does, right? Yeah, or a race car or something.
Yeah.
I tried a bunch of masks. That was the one that really seemed like it worked for me. So maybe I'll get, one of the surgeries done. Inspire, I think, is the one.
Okay.
They suit you up with a little automatic stimulation device, I think.
Really? Huh.
Yeah. Yeah. It's built in. I think there's a chip in there so they can make sure you don't go off grid.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. Who knows?
Let's see. Anything else we had here? So how about this one? Why does a high sugar cheat meal like ice cream make me so ravenous after, especially when I'm on a low carb diet the whole week?
I think it could be ghrelin being released.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my guess. Like physiologically.
That's the worst, man. Like you can be on keto for a month and not have any cravings at all. And then you're like, I'm going to have a cheat meal. And then after that, the next 3 days, it's like all I want to do is eat.
Yeah. And also the ketones have an appetite suppressing effect too. Yeah. An anorexic effect, technically speaking. So getting out of ketosis. That's why when people do CKDs, a lot of the big thing is like, I want to get into ketosis as fast as I can. Because when after I do my refeed, I do my carb up, like on Sunday or whatever.
Yeah.
If I don't get back in ketosis, I just keep on thinking about wanting more carbs for the next 2 days.
Yeah.
So they do all sorts of stuff like, waking up in the morning fasted, doing cardio right off the bat, and not eating anything for a while.
Okay.
So you can sort of drive the insulin down and glucagon up and get the ketones. So once the ketones are there systemic, that might be the thing that makes ketogenic dieting work for some people versus others, is that they just don't want to eat as much. Low carb works great for me for dieting. My appetite goes to just very, very minimal.
Yeah.
I do great with it. It's easy.
I'll bring this last one up here and then we'll hit it. I'm not familiar with this Humafort.
Yeah, no experience with it. Humanafort.
Humanafort? Yeah. What is that?
Yeah. It's I can't even probably describe it. It's I'm blanking on the guy's name. There's an IFBB pro on Professional Muscle, I can see him in my mind's eye. Seems like he's a really nice guy. A lot of people over there use it. I would look over there to see people's experiences. It's all over the place. You read, sometimes people say I didn't do anything at all for me, and then some people say it was the greatest thing ever. It's sort of an Eastern Bloc, I believe, recovery complex that's organically derived, and I couldn't tell you the details about it. I looked into it a long time ago, and there actually is some research out there. I think it's maybe in like Romanian or something like that.
Okay.
It's either you kind of love it or you don't, but I don't know much about it to give a really anything remotely close to an astute answer. So I can't say I don't have any experience. I didn't give it a go.
Weird. Yeah, no, I don't know why, but I never heard of this before.
Yeah, type in Humanifort over on Professional Muscle, and
I just looked it up.
Hundreds.
It also says a bunch of other stuff. It says, is your endocrine system balanced? It's good for depression, mood changes, hot flashes, everything. Yeah, irritability. I got all these things. I got irritability sometimes. Yeah. I have fatigue. I have poor sleep. Low libido.
You're Humanifort deficient.
Yes, that's what it is. Yeah. Man, so you're going to have this. So it sounds like this is going to be a 2-part thing for the IGF thing, huh?
I think I just put it into 2 videos because it was getting long and I wanted to make sure my computer didn't crash or something like that. So I just kind of stopped halfway through.
Yeah.
And people are, 90 minutes is a long video all to have in one.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, it ended up being kind of in 2 parts. All I did was just stop the video after one slide and I just picked it up. I didn't didn't leave any cliffhangers or anything like that. But yeah, I think it'll be out in the next week or so. I sent it off to RJ, who runs John's site.
Okay.
Like last week. So you should have it out.
Nice.
It's funny you mentioned Steve. He just came out with the IGF. Literally, he came out with. I saw that video probably because the algorithm, like they're watching. They knew I was looking up all this IGF-1 stuff, and all of a sudden Steve's video comes out and he's got it, and he's saying like, "I'm not going to send you any of this. I'm not going to tell you who my source is. Just stop." He said it like 5 times.
I can imagine. Yeah. People are like, "Where'd you get it from, dude? Steve? Where'd you get it?"
Yeah, he has an autoresponder on his Instagram.
Yeah, he does. Yeah,
I was on his podcast a week or so ago.
Oh, were you? No kidding.
Yeah.
What did you guys talk about?
Yeah, you were in all sorts of stuff.
Okay.
Mainly drug related things, but we were on there for like 2 hours.
Okay, cool.
And it was funny because he's like, man, just be ready when this comes out. You're gonna just get bombarded with requests for consultations. And I got a sum total of 0. I got none.
Hey,
but I took that as a good thing because I think like I made it clear I'm not like in the business of just telling people how to use drugs.
Yeah.
So they saw that, I think, and that's not the currency that people are wanting to buy nowadays. So I got no requests for consultations as a result of that I know of. I don't think I had nothing in the next week.
You're good at helping people think. Like we talked about IGF here today, and you didn't tell anybody how to do anything, but you sure gave me some ideas on how I might want to if I were to do it. You know what I mean?
I mean, it's like it is really with the IGF-1. It's like I can totally see why it wouldn't work for anybody, and I can totally see why it might work for somebody. And just that stuff with the cultured muscle cells from the rectus abdominis of those surgery patients. It's like it's all over the place with humans. When you find that stuff, it's like, okay, this makes sense.
Yeah.
And you know what? I'll add this in. Just one sort of thing that was interesting is that with anabolic steroids, I can't remember which year it was now, but I think there were 2 position stands from the American College of Sports Medicine, the first 2 on anabolic steroids, where they said they don't work because the literature, or what they said is that the literature at this time does not support an anabolic effect or whatever of anabolic steroids. The purported effect is not supported by the literature we have available at this time. Yeah. But those were all low dose studies.
Oh, is that what it was?
That was didn't have like the Boson et al. Study with 600 milligrams of testosterone a week, or they had just like self-report things, like people taking X amount of gear and et cetera, and you're not going to see much change with someone who's at that level over 3 or 4 months.
Yeah,
they just didn't have the direct studies with higher doses that we now have available to demonstrate that effect. So, but effective dosing of IGF-1 in the context of endogenous production is sort of in that range. It's comparable to what the state of the literature was then with anabolic steroids, and was like, no, of course they didn't work. But the thing is, who has $5,000 to spend a day on IGF-1 to way supersede endogenous production,
Yeah.
or dose it at a regimen where you're overcoming all of these binding protein potentialities. Like it's a total different animal compared to steroids or like growth hormone. 10 IUs of growth hormone is like 10, 15 times endogenous production a day.
Yeah.
Or 1,000 milligrams of testosterone is 10 times endogenous production per day. But you can't get 10 times IGF-1 production per day with anything other than a billionaire's budget. And then if you did that, who knows? That might be the case where Rhonda Patrick could be dead on. Like now you're just asking for a tumor, right?
Yeah.
You're doing that.
Yeah, yeah. So what you really need is like there's got to be somebody who's on the inside. They know somebody who's like, hey, they work at this company, they can get it. And then there's going to be a bodybuilder out there who's doing the 10 milligrams a day.
I mean, the thing is, and I'm not going to say like there are some, because I'm not an expert in this area, but there's drug design potential, like these vectors, these viral vectors that they injected in the muscle in these animal studies, and they overproduced IGF-1 locally and produced muscle growth in that muscle, right? Like that's something that could be had. Like you can read that study and you could find out where they got in that injection, and then you could hope that those viruses don't make their way into your prostate or whatever and give you prostate cancer. That would probably be a way to get it, I think. And if drug development were geared towards bodybuilders, towards producing local hypertrophy, there would be drugs available to do that based on IGF-1's actions. Those things, they can be developed pharmacologically. That's totally possible. That study demonstrates it, the one I just mentioned.
Yeah.
But IGF-1 is being used for that purpose. It's for dwarfism. Right. And they're not trying to produce local muscle. You don't just want a bunch of really buff dwarfs who aren't tall. Like the idea is to increase their bone structure.
Right.
And everything else, relatively. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's why they give it, for instance, in that one formulation with IGF-1 binding protein 3.
Yeah. It seems like there would be some benefits though.
Way.
Somebody has an underdeveloped something or post-surgery or after a tear. But I guess it's not enough to warrant the investment into creating that at this time.
I think too, like even like dwarfism, you can say that's something that substantially affects that person's quality of life. Like their life is dramatically changed by technically being handicapped if they're less than 4'10" or 5 foot tall, whatever the legal description of that is. There's like if you're below 4'10" in many states, you can apply for handicap status because you're so short.
That makes sense.
But there's this balance, and this is what I tried to accentuate in that talk for Mountain Dog Diet is you better be damn sure if you're going to create a local IGF-1 viral vector, what have you, that's going to help someone recover a torn muscle or repair broken bone or what have you. Bone would be even more difficult than muscle. You better be dang sure that's localized, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't go and look. I'd have to dig in, but because if that gets out elsewhere, and like it doesn't take much, even if it's just. I mean, here's the thing with the animal studies, right? I mean, if you inject that animal and I accidentally hit a vein. And I didn't go into the muscle tissue and stay localized, and it went systemic, and it goes to the person's, heart or whatever, and they develop a heart tumor or something, some bizarre thing like that. Well, if that happens in an animal study, well, then that animal just gets put to sleep, and that's it. And they mention it maybe. Sometimes they don't. People don't even mention those things. That's there's all sorts of shenanigans that happen in the research world.
Yeah.
People should go to retractionwatch.org if they want to read about bad science.
Oh yeah.
But it's kind of scary. But if you're doing research with animals, then that's a lost animal. You just add another one to replace it. But if with a human, if that happens one time out of 1,000, well then that's it. You're gone, baby. Lawsuit.
Yeah.
You take a company down with that kind of an issue. So the risk benefit ratio is not particularly great for developing, although we're technically able to, but this just doesn't make sense. legally and risk to benefit ratio wise.
Yeah, I guess that would make sense. Yeah, I wish I could find this video, Scott. I had a video of you training. Remember I showed you that video the other day?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
was
I had
it
one
from that same weekend, or
yeah, it was. I had one of you training at the Arnold. I was looking to see if I could pull that. You know what? I just found it.
Okay.
I wonder if I can. This would be a good way to. This would be a good way to go out here.
Okay.
No, this is a cable. This is a cable you did. Let me see if I can first get this saved. I have to move it really quick. Let's see if it takes a second here. What's happening? I think I moved it.
I take it this was a good set. Somehow you
remember. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a good set. When I saw this video, I was like, oh, shit.
Right.
I think if I pull it in this way. Oh, there it is. Reveal and Finder. Yeah. So, guys, we're going to go out on this one. Check this out.
See how many reps in reserve.
How many reps in reserve you get?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, it's a drop set. I remember that machine now.
Yeah, this is at Mike Davies' gym.
Mm-hmm. So doing little cheat reps there.
Got all your gym pins lined up there.
Yeah. I think those were just pins. I carry those around in my.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. And now some cheats.
We're about a little more than half, 2/3 of the way done now.
Oh shit! Okay. I remember I was totally doing deadlift or drop sets for a long time.
Yeah. Oh, come on.
You're doing a fiver. I'm trying to pull that really low to my.
Yeah, you are. Is that you were jacked there and tan too?
Yeah,
this is a good look.
The mohawk, it's the mohawk, baby.
Yeah, that was sweet. That was great, man. Yeah, hell of a set, as Finn says here. All right, well, let's say we get out of here, guys. Of course, besides the Mountain Dog site, you can go over there, Mountain Dog Diet, I believe it is, right? MountainDogDiet.com.
Yeah.
That'll be coming up pretty soon if you guys want to join over there. Even if you just join for the month, just to see Scott's video, that'd be awesome. Andrew's part of that over there too. I'm sure you'll see a bunch of stuff with him, and I know Nate Spears over there too. They'll do a video now and again too. And of course, go to fortitudetraining.net. Check out Scott's training plan, and byobbcoach.com, or go to just look up Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach. You can do that on Amazon to get the hardcover. And as we mentioned, you can get collagen, hydrolyzed beef collagen like I use, or a bunch of other stuff from True Nutrition. Use our code THINK over there. I just placed like a big $200 order with them this morning. That helps. Using our code lets them know that you support what we're doing. And if you haven't shopped with them before, give them a try. Give them a try. And like I said, the code, it definitely helps our show. Along with, supplementsource.ca for our Canadians, because they have great deals that change week to week, like just different blowouts or label changes, things where like if they have a closeout on something or it's short dated, then you'll be like, $20. Like I said a while ago, I saw some John Metal recovery, the granite recovery for $20. So it's like you can't beat that. Just grab like 3 tubs of it. It's still good, I promise.
Yeah.
And check out Amino Asylum. Use our code THINK over there for your IGF needs, all your IGF needs. Anyway, guys, we'll see you soon. Thank you, Scott, as always, and thank you guys for tuning into the live stream.
My pleasure, brother. Until next time.